Ahoy! There's a good chance a lot of you can increase your damage in New World without changing anything about your gear, without getting any more attributes or any special perks or anything, just by adjusting certain things. And that is exactly what I want to talk about today, because this is a topic that I think is very important, especially for new players. Before we get into that, if you're interested in early trading tips, I keep posting those on my Patreon, so feel free to support me there. What we're looking into today is stat distribution. So we're going to start out with a bow here, which is an example where this is sometimes used, scales purely with dexterity. We're going to put in 350 dex, and we are going to shoot a dummy here with a light shot first. I'm not going to use a crit one, so we're going to use the value that we get if we're not getting a crit. There we go, 2131 on a light attack. Now we're going to use a heavy attack as well, and here we get 3197. So these two numbers are our baseline. Now we're going to put 20 points into dexterity. This will up our damage, that's the goal. A light attack now does 2174 damage, so slight increase here. And our heavy attack will do 3261. Again, small increase, but it's still an increase. Now what we can do instead is take these points back out, go to 350 dex again, and put the 20 points into strength instead. What this will give us, at exactly 20 points, is the first capstone, which increases our light attack damage. And this is very interesting, because the damage value that we're getting here now is 2217. If we look at our numbers in comparison here, then this is actually the highest damage output that we can reach with the light attack. This means in case of the heavy attack, we actually take in a reduction because we're not getting the same increase. So in this case, that is 3197, which is the same value as just 350 dex. Makes sense because we didn't do anything else to that value afterwards. But our light attack goes up in damage. And this is something that you can replicate in similar ways for various other weapons with various other splits, which is very important. We can, for example, go further here and do heavy attack damage, which could be relevant for some builds. And we could, for example, utilize this light attack damage for something like a Void Blade build. You could go into int and focus, but then get this capstone for some extra light attack damage. And similar ideas can be applied in various different ways. A very popular example that I think is worth bringing up is just a traditional war build. Here we'd obviously go heavily into strength because we are going to get a lot of damage out of that with our weapons. They both scale with strength, but we also get very strong passives, especially here at the end. We're getting a 10% base damage increase to abilities, and the final attack and immediate light attack chain does some more damage as well. Not necessarily strictly crucial in every setup that you can do. There are definitely setups with more constitution as well, but if you're trying to go for a bursty build, then this is obviously a passive that you would want, and then the rest would go into constitution. However, you don't necessarily need to put everything in constitution. I think the 200 constitution passive is nice, but if we're going beyond the gear score that was previously the maximum, we can technically go up to here, and I don't think that has enough value because there are other passives that are much more relevant for us. And in one case, that is definitely the focus passive. Especially for a bruiser, the utility that you get from this cooldown reduction, I think, is massive. So let's try that out first. And normally, if we throw a graph well, we come out with a 25-second cooldown right here with the amount of refreshing that I have on this set. It's not optimized yet. You can see it has 3 out of 4 pieces at the moment. But now with these 25 points in focus, same ability comes out at 24 seconds. And it's a slightly bigger split than that, I think, but the rounding makes it look like that. It should be around 1.5 seconds difference, but as you can imagine, for bruisers where this burst is your main form of aggression, in between that you have a significant downtime, this is very relevant. But we could also think in another direction. The Great Axe specifically has some benefits in terms of extra crit damage through Keen Edge, and we can kind of play with that. We're going to respec here because we don't want to end up getting various passives while we try this, but normally our backstab damage here would be 2695. However, we can again put another 20 points into strength here to see what the result of that would be in terms of damage increase. And as you can see, we are now at 2,749, a slight increase once again. I'm also going to take the non-crit damage here as well, that is 2,082, because we want to see the value that we get in both aspects. Now we're going back to 350 strength, but instead of putting our points elsewhere, we're going to put our points into intelligence. The extra 20 points are now going into intelligence, which gives us the 5% damage to backstabs and random critical hits. For a backstab, this results in 2,784 damage. Once again, a higher increase here than going for pure strength instead. For a frontal attack, we're getting 2,041 damage, so this is something that you have to debate more. As you can see here, you gain some damage on the backstabs or on the crits, but you lose more damage if you're not critting, and that makes it a decision that is more based on your playstyle and your role. As a bruiser in a main clump, I don't think you're usually critting often enough to justify this, whereas as someone who is chasing targets, this has more value. If you're finding this info useful so far, then consider subscribing and clicking the bell. Now, on the head shit, I think this is also a very interesting option. My current build doesn't quite have enough attribute points yet to do this properly, so just imagine that I would put another 50 points into con here, so I could reach 200 con, and that I have a 200-200 split, and the rest of the points was free to use. So we're gonna check our base damage value here on the backstab, that is 2,428, and on the front attack that is 1,700, I think it was 14. Now, if we put another 20 points into strength, that would basically be our most significant damage increase we could do this way. Our backstab damage now would be 2,493. Our frontal damage would be 1,760. We'll do the same thing again, only this time we're putting the 20 points into intelligence for the backstab damage. Our backstab damage is now 2,499. Our frontal damage, on the other hand, remains at 1,714. So again, we can see that we're getting a little bit more damage in terms of backstab damage out of speccing into int. We're talking about 6 points of damage here. At the same time, we're losing a more significant amount on frontal hits, and we're talking about 46 at this point. I personally would much prefer the significantly higher reliable front damage, but I know that some people are in for the maximum backstab damage possible at all times and build the entire build around that, at which point you might as well consider these points as well. What this also means is that slotting an item with some int on it is not the end of the world for builds like this. If all the other perks on it are very good for you, you might want to consider a split item with int or something just to save some money. In my Evade Rapier build, where you want to min-max your cooldown reduction as much as possible so you can just be spamming abilities with as little light attacks in between, I always run 25 focus. If I had it, I would also run the Nimble Leather Coat, but I haven't unlocked that on this character, so that's not an option. But if you run this along with maximum refreshing, you will have very, very, very short cooldowns. Similarly, also secondary capstones can be considered. For example, plus 10% incoming healing can be very interesting for tank rolls, even if you are not using a flail, because it can be very useful for your general situation as a tank to just get significantly increased healing at all times. 50 intelligence is something that can be considered due to the base damage increase via damage over time effects, which pretty much everyone has on them all the time. Builds that lean heavily into crit chance can definitely consider the 25 dexterity perk here. This is, for example, once again something that Voidblade builds can consider. Now keep in mind that excessively splitting stats is not always the best option. For example, if you're going for 350 con, then you may really want to get this, and you may, for example, if you mix that with strength, want to max out strength to as far as you can get otherwise, so you may not be able to flex points the same way. And there are certain other builds that also generally don't benefit from these things as much. I think an int build will not necessarily, depending on what weapon it is, but not necessarily benefit that much from 5% more cooldown reduction, because they already can shorten their cooldowns, for example on Fire Staff. Maybe benefit from the strength, but maybe also not that much. Maybe from the dex. It is worth considering, but often it is higher value, especially if you're going for AoE damage, to just go more into intelligence and into constitution. So there is no universal answer with these points. It takes a lot of trial and error to find what works best for you. But I find that in very few builds that actually just splitting between 2 attributes. With the 3 attribute splits, you often have to find out for yourself if the extra split like into intelligence is worth it. It depends on your offhand as well, if they both scale with the same double stats, like for example a rapier plus a greatsword. But depending on that, your situation may change a little bit, and some things may be more or less worth considering. But overall, I think it is definitely worth keeping in mind that this option exists at any point. You have these lower points here that can be very, very useful in some builds. I hope this was helpful. If it was, consider subscribing and clicking the bell. And if you'd like to support me further, you can do so on Patreon. Thanks to all of my patrons who already do exactly that. And thank you for watching. Sloth, out.